Welcome friends to another Dune video. This one is a compilation of previous ones that have been released on the channel in relation to the Fremen, and I've done quite a few, so you can see it's quite a long video. And what it covers is the Fremen, the origins and culture from the beginning around the Jihad when they arrived on Arrakis, through to and including the first Dune novel by Frank Herbert. We draw on Frank Herbert's work in Dune, prequels written by his son and Kevin J. Anderson, and the Dune Encyclopaedia, to provide a, hopefully, in-depth look at this fascinating, to me at least, culture. So spoilers for those books, if you've not read them. And we begin with the origins and how they reached Arrakis.
Would it hurt if your home was taken from you? It hurt the Fremen. This is their story. The Fremen came to Dune. They were not native to the desert planet. So where did they come from, and how did that prepare them to survive on Arrakis? This information is taken from the Dune Encyclopaedia. Spoilers for that throughout, let's get straight into it. The Emperor of the Imperium, Elrond V, accepted the planet Poritrim from another great house, Maros, and wanted to populate it, and looked to Earth for those people. He demanded a levy of 2 million people be delivered to him. Now Earth citizens are usually exempt from such a draft, but there were Zensunni nomads on the planet. They were herded aboard transports, 2.5 million of them, and taken via the Spacing Guild to Poritrin. The planet had water, a long farming season, and a gentle climate. The nomads used their beliefs to explain what had happened to them, that they had fled to this planet to escape persecution, and that they would complete their time on Poritrin and have a great journey to find an answer to that persecution. So they had a good life on the planet, but the Landsraad, a body that represents all the great houses, wanted it, and raiders came and moved the nomads to 2 new planets. One of them was Seleucia Secundus, and we will follow them for now. The nomads took this as part of their great journey, or Hajra. Those who reached Seleucia Secundus found it was a harsh planet, where 6 out of every 13 died due to the planet's ecology. The Fremen held to their community, and the Sardaukar tried to break their spirit, using them as slaves to perform dangerous tasks. And as they resisted, with each generation, the oppression became worse. But the Fremen adapted. They reverted to their nomadic life in the Sahara on Earth. Their population stabilized. Perhaps seeing this, the Sardaukar, the Emperor's troops, tried to take their religion a source of strength for them. Over half their numbers were butchered, including the Reverend Mothers. But the nomads' faith held, and new Saidina were inducted. Saidina is a Zensunni name for Reverend Mothers. I will use both in this text. Some nomads pretended to go along with the Sardaukar's beliefs, and I assume the Sardaukar wanted to recruit them. During weapons training, they would kill their trainers and fellow students and then themselves. Eventually, Ezra VII reviewed what had been happening, and seeing the treatment of the nomads, transferred those still alive to a new planet, Ishia. Other nomads taken to Rossak after the first winter and disease ravaged them struggled to stay alive. Most native plants to Rossak were poisonous, and this drove their numbers down even further. One Saidina, desperate with hunger, ate a plant and found herself within the minds of all the Saidina who had come before her. The poison did kill her, but what she had done was passed on to others who would live and have the memories of those before on the female side. The Reverend Mothers worked out the exact poison needed so they would know the ways of their ancestors and take up that path for themselves. Eventually, it became the belief that Poritrin, the first planet they had been taken to, was the nomads' homeworld, and only a few Reverend Mothers or Saidinas knew and passed on the truth through their ancestral memory. So on Rossak, the Zensunni made a choice to move themselves. They worked and gathered money for future generations to escape. Later, the Naibs, or community leaders, decided on a destination, but only for a small portion of their population. They had not been able to raise enough for all. A Saidina was given the ancestral memories, so that legacy was not lost. I assume both groups of Zensunni, those from Rossack and those from Seleucus Secundus, were reunited on Ischia. Either way, they found it was hot and arid. You worked hard for the little food that would grow there. One day out could kill the crop. The Zensunni found adapting to the desert ecology hard, but reverted to the ways of their ancestors and lived with the desert and didn't struggle against it. As part of this, the first still tent was created. Perhaps with the Saidina and their memories now active, they used that to survive as above. And as you can see, both groups of nomads, before being reunited, survived because they stayed true to their community and the desert ways of their ancestors. I think that strength still shows during the first Dune novel. What they didn't know was the choice of Ischia was made by the Spacing Guild, a place for them to train for Arrakis, and in 7193 AG, all the pockets of nomads were taken to Arrakis, the end of their great Hajra. It was done by the guild in secret. It gave the Zensunni a home where they would be hard to dig out and move, even by the Sardaukar. And I think from here you can see how far back the rivalry goes between the Zensunni and the Sardaukar. And it also gave the guild a way into Arrakis should they need a pipeline, as without the spice from Dune, the guild would be unable to perform its function. With it, they would be able to bypass whichever house ruled the planet, if spice from them became scarce. The guild made sure the Zensunni were allowed to establish themselves deep in the desert, so that those already on the planet, mainly housed around Arrakeen, the capital, would not notice them and pay them little attention if they did. From here, the Zensunni recognized themselves as a whole people. Their journey was complete. They had found a home. They were the free men, the Fremen.
Now we take a look at one of the pivotal characters in their history who helped find so much of what identified them later, such as riding sandworms and understanding the nature of the spice on Arrakis.
Fremen at this time were known as the Zensunni, and they had much to learn about the ways of the desert. They lived in caves, barely existing, and didn't know much about the sandworms either. Selim was banished by them. His friend had blamed him for the theft of water when he was innocent. He would die with no water out in the desert, or be eaten by Shaitan, the demon worm of the desert. He headed for a shelter of black rock and felt the ripples of a sand demon coming for him, and ran. But upon seeing he would not reach safety, he slowed. Even then, the Zensunni knew vibrations attracted worms. Perhaps he could fool it. He threw 3 stones and the worm turned, but still came so close he could smell cinnamon from its maw. Cinnamon is the scent of spice. He would still eat him, so Selim desperately attacked with his metal walking stick. And it hit a worm segment rather than its skin, and the worm turned. Selim was lifted up but held on, and to his surprise the creature did not go beneath the sand but kept on going above ground. He realized it wanted to stop its inner flesh being hit by sand and being irritated by it, and so Selim was carried by it into the deep desert. Hours passed, and Selim could not believe he was riding this desert demon until it ground to a halt and stopped moving. He was able to climb down, and he ran until realizing it was dead because it wasn't coming after him. Now he would need food, and saw veins of spice melange. Checking there was no worm sign, he ate it raw. It gave him energy, and he marched towards the worm's body, and he noticed the fangs in its cavernous mouth, and he felt urged to take one. He stepped in and pulled one out. It was as long as his forearm. No one else possessed such a tooth, knife, or Crysknife, as it becomes known later. Then he realized he must find shelter, and did so in an ancient botanical testing station, and he found preserved food there, and he swears next time he rides a worm, it will not be by fluke. After 10 attempts riding a worm, he was proficient and could enjoy it, and he saw the sandworms as a blessing, a manifestation of God, and during this time he discovered you could dismount a sandworm with some risk, and did not have to ride them to death. You could dismount from a wary beast by running down the length of its back, leaping away from the hot tail, and then racing towards nearby rocks. On the 4th try, he had also found that you could prod the worm in the right direction with a shovel-bladed tool in its sensitive opening. He had been reborn in the desert after being thrown out by his Naib, and had thrived. He had become Selim Wormrider. He travelled to a small village as he needed more tools, and amongst what he was after, he found a sonic hammer that might let him expand natural caves. He drops the hammer when trying to leave, and its pulse fractured the ground of the cave. The village began to wake and came for him. Selim was pursued into the desert. He used the sonic hammer a few times, creating an explosion of sound as a worm finally approached his pursuers, slowed, and then ran away. To save them, Selim guided the worm towards him with a slow thump, and they saw, as he rode away in it, what he was using to guide it, a rope and spreaders. Now how he rides sandworms is very much developing towards how the Fremen ride them in the original Dune novel by Frank Herbert, as well as slowly developing the understanding of how the thumpers will eventually work. As Selim rode away, the worm brought him to a fresh spice blow, and the melange engulfed him. He saw the life cycle linking the worms and the spice, and of course the planet, and a name came to him, Shai-Hulud, the name of a being, a god. And then he saw the spice leaving Arrakis, taken by off-worlders, and Arrakis dying for that same reason. He knew how the spice connected everything on Arrakis, all the life that is there. He must find those who take the spice and stop them. I see echoes here of Paul Atreides in the original Dune novel when he takes the water of life, the visions that he experiences and what that means to him. Is quite a profound moment for him, as it is for Selim here. Later, Selim watched how his former tribe now collected spice and harvested it. He would stop it. He called Shai-Hulud with the sonic hammer and drove the worm into their encampment. It hit the camp and then the melange. It was safe for now. He left water for the Zensunni to survive and declared his identity to them. When we check in with the Wormrider again, he has a small group of followers with him, and from one he took a wafer of melange. His eyes were now blue. With it, he now had visions to help guide him. His people now wear distilling suits to help them live in the desert. A young follower dies, trying to prove he should join them by riding a worm. The suit is an early Stillsuit perhaps, and coming of age by riding a worm is very much similar to when Paul is tested to do the same by Stilgar. Selim, upon hearing that Naib Dartha had had great success with taking spice and had now united several Zensunni tribes, Selim planned to make a statement to them. He planned to strike the spice caravan. His people unleashed boulders that fell to block the caravan's path. His followers then surrounded the caravans, and then he warns them of what will happen if they carry on down the path they are currently on. Maha marries Selim, and he declares their marriage before Shai-Hulud. The bandits eat a lot of melange to celebrate, and taking it, inhibitions fell, and many became new-found lovers, bound by the red dust of Shai-Hulud. Something similar happens when Jessica Atreides takes the water of life, converts the poison inside her into something that will not harm people, and then shares some of that she regurgitates with the tribe. For a short moment, that connects the Fremen in mind through the spice's effects. Selim wakes and says to stop the spice being taken off-world. Perhaps it is more than one man can accomplish, but not beyond the capability of a legend. Naib Dartha sends his grandson to find the Wormrider so a truce can be called, but he fails. Then the grandson goes to ride a worm to prove himself, and in the effort to do that, he dies. The Naib blames Selim, so he leads a band to fight him. But when he arrives, Selim's group has gone, except for the man himself, who sits and strikes a drum. Naib Dartha challenges Selim, and the off-world soldiers turn on their personal shields. Selim knew those shields would send out a summoning to Shai-Hulud, and Selim, shortly afterwards, feels the ground moving, and then he emerged. The shields having driven him into a frenzy, the worm has arrived. It scooped up many soldiers in one sweep with its mouth. The flyer that had brought in those soldiers fired and hurt the worm, but then another worm appeared like a cobra and knocked the flyer from the air. The remaining warriors fled. Dartha was left by himself, and another worm came up beneath Dartha, his yawning mouth a huge maw filled with crystal teeth, and it swallowed him whole, and then it took Selim too on a final ride down its gullet. Maha, mother of his child, his wife, wailed when he died. Shai-Hulud had made Selim part of his flesh and made him into a legend, and to later generations, and I'm sure you can see his influence in what the Fremen have learned from him. Now we're going to follow Ishmael and the son of Selim Wormrider, who he gets involved with. I'm going to look about how their relationship leads to a split between Fremen, where there are more in the city and more in the deep desert separated from them. When Ishmael was only a boy of 10, he saw Tlulaxa people assault his village, and he and a cousin were captured and taken to Pardot. He was there and found work finding clam seedlings in the mudflats. Then he was moved into the home of Teo Holtzman and became a member of his team of solvers, and became friends with an unruly man called Khaled Alid, and then worked as part of a team making a giant mosaic. When a rebellion happened with Ben Muley Ishmael, and Alid destroyed it and were punished physically. To be more specific, they destroyed the mosaic. This quietened the rebellion down. The leader of it was executed, which they both remembered. It stayed with them. Later, Ishmael took a wife, Ozza, and he had 2 daughters. He used his faith to encourage strength in his fellow slaves. He was, at the time, helping build a decoy fleet. He wanted recognition for his contribution. Ishmael went to speak with Nico Blood, but he was instead separated from his family and taken to work with Norma Kenver, who is someone that's partnered with Teo Holtzman on his ships and developments in shield technology. Ishmael continued to preach to those he was now with about his beliefs, and after several years, he saw his daughter amongst a group of new slaves. Ishmael learns of a plot to have a revolt on the 28th anniversary of Pardot. He preached non-violence, but during the revolt, Tuk Kider is forced to pilot them away. But that man is no pilot and only knows the way to Arrakis. And with the Holtzwood technology, they arrive there, and they all find how hostile Arrakis is, with the heat and little moisture that strips away their numbers, leading to a third of them being dead over a 5-month period. And a man called Jafar finds them and accepts them into the band of the Wormrider, outlaws who, after the death of Selim Wormrider, have carried on what he set up. Ishmael meets Selim's widow, Maha, and takes care of her son, Elhim, and went so far as to save that young boy's life. And in the end, he married Marcia, and Ishmael became Naib, and Elhim became Ishmael's surrogate son. As time goes on, Maha died. Her son wanted her to be treated by scientists in an Arrakis-based city. Ishmael, now siding with the ideals of Selim, did not trust off-worlders because of his experiences with them. Before she passed, Maha had sworn her husband to help her son with advice. As the boy grew into a man, he became Naib, and he continued to trust off-worlders and trade spice, again with the wishes of Ishmael, pushing back against that. So Ishmael decides to re-educate Elhim. They went on a pilgrimage, riding a worm, but on their return their village, whilst they were away, had been devastated by slavers. But between them, they managed to figure out where those slavers had come from. Elhim raised what had happened with the authorities, whilst Ishmael organised a meeting to discuss what to do. Elhim then goes with them to the slavers' camp. They fight, and Ishmael catches Warif, a Tlulaxa linked with the slavery, and Ishmael orders that the people that have gone there with him seek payment in blood, and that they return it to the desert as water. After the raid, Ishmael and Elhim argued over Ishmael's violent attack on the slavers, and one thing in particular was draining the blood from their enemies to take their water. Elhim's preference was for contact and trade with off-worlders, but Ishmael wanted to return to the ways of Selim Wormrider, who had discovered so much of what had become standard for the Fremen, and Ishmael wanted to lead them into the deep desert away from off-worlders and outside influences. So Elhim and Ishmael had what you can only describe as a battle between giant sandworms, with each of them riding one of them. The worms charge at each other, and the conflict ended after ring segments had been knocked off each worm. It was Elhim who won the conflict. With this loss, Ishmael led some of his supporters from Elhim's village into the deep desert, getting some of what he had wanted in the first place, and Ishmael vowed to build his own isolated settlements and avoid outsiders. And many generations down the line, these people that went with him probably became the Fremen, the Duncan and Paul's mother encounter in Dune.
Next we look at another pivotal figure, Pardot Kynes, and his deep influence on the Fremen and how they see Arrakis.
Pardot Kynes saw the desert world of Arrakis as seed capable of magnificent growth, provided the environment received the proper care. The Harkonnens only plundered the planet for profit, or other opportunists such as smugglers and water merchants also took advantage of it. And whilst doing his work, Pardot comes across a battle between the Fremen and the Harkonnens. The Fremen are young, the Harkonnens are armed and shielded. Pardot thinks he can't let the forces of the Baron kill the workers, and the Fremen are the tools he will need to remake the planet. Silently he aided them, severing one man's spinal cord, and he also ended the next one's life as well. And when the rest are finished off with the Fremen help, they communicate. One Fremen is injured and uses a medpack to make sure he has a steady heartbeat, and Pardot also saw the blood coagulate faster than it normally would. One of the Fremen he saw also dug the eye out of one of the Harkonnens, and Kynes wonders if he has made the right choice. Then the bodies of the Harkonnens and the Fremen, both injured and uninjured, get into Kynes' car and drive it off without him. But one Fremen did remain behind, and that Fremen says to follow him, and Turok says they have a water bond between them, and he takes Kynes to his Sietch. Within the Sietch, being treated as a young Stilgar, Kynes smelled the dense aroma as he went inside. As the book tells us, the aromas of the Sietch were dense, rich and redolent with humanity, smells of life, of a confined population, of manufacturing, cooking, carefully concealed wastes, and even chemically exploited death. Kynes sees how advanced the Fremen are as he moves through the Sietch, through the side caves and lava tubes and tunnels. He sees luxury carpets and cushioned tables, metal and stone all clouded in the cinnamon smell of spice, overlaying the strong smell of unwashed bodies. And then, in a large hall, Kynes is introduced to the head of the Sietch, Hainar, head of Redwall Sietch, their Naib. They exchange words, and Kynes is asked if he challenges Hainar's leadership. Kynes replies no, and they talk more, and Kynes shares his dream with him and with the people in the Sietch, from old men tending Eater supplies to grandmothers operating solar ovens, and as he does this, he sees the activities that go on in the Sietch, as the book tells it. The bustling activity around the sealed caves astonished him. Some workers trampled spice residue to extract fuel, others curded spice for fermentation. Weavers at power looms used their own hair, the long fur of mutated rats, wisps of desert cotton, and even skin strips from wild creatures to make their durable fabric. And of course schools taught the young Fremen desert skills, as well as ruthless combat techniques. Kynes is given a tour by Turok, and he asks if he can establish a weather station there. He goes to gather some equipment and saw what had been done to many of his possessions, because the Fremen saw items as communal, and Kynes had not yet bought into that aspect of them. Meanwhile, the elders debate his fate, and it's decided that he must die to protect the Sietch, as he works for the Emperor. Later, Stilgar finds Kynes and thanks him for the rescue. And for what he has done, Kynes is given a fixed Crysknife dipped in the water of life. A waterman, under the orders of the elders, goes to collect Kynes' water. And as he approaches Kynes, he hears the man speak of the dream of Arrakis, about turning it into a paradise. And as he approaches to take Kynes' life, Pardot raises the Crysknife, but the waterman thinks that if he kills this man, he will destroy that dream, a dream for the Fremen's future. So instead, he sees Pardot as a prophet and turns the knife, his own knife, on himself. The actions of the Fremen convinced others of Pardot's value, and he lives. Kynes continues to work for the Emperor, but is secretly allied to the Fremen now. Later, he was to be married. The first time an outsider was married to a Fremen, and it was to Stilgar's unwed sister, Frith. A Saidina leads the party into the open sands. Frith wears the Fremen black robes of a woman betrothed, and water rings in her hair, both hers and her husband's. Kynes had donated water from his ground car to obtain them, and dancers moved in front of him like a sandstorm. In another form of acceptance, his eyes were now the blue of the Fremen, and the Saidina speaks a series of words in Chakobsa, and then he was married to Frith. Later she becomes pregnant, and with his child being on its way, he commits to make Arrakis a paradise that would take many generations. He estimates 300 to 500 years. Buying into his dream, the Fremen begin to refer to him as their prophet. Then he goes on a long journey far to the south. Stilgar calls the distance 20 thumpers. Kynes had found, before this journey, a large salt pan, which has convinced him he has now no doubts the planet had once had open water, and on this journey he sees depressions that might have been ancient lakes, and then on land he and the party pushed on towards the Antarctic Circle, where worms could not travel. No one explored these areas, and here Kynes revealed a vast treasure, evidence of the dream, a secret camp, and he saw there were hot springs running here through the use of solar mirrors and magnifiers, and this water had nurtured plants. He tells his wife they have done this in less than a year, and he also saw the start of palm trees. Later someone arrives and tells Kynes the number of Fremen of Arrakis is 10 million, and that he now has a son. In the deep south, away from the eyes of the Harkonnens, the Fremen had begun to seed life in the desert, such as poverty grasses along the downward sides of dunes, anchoring them across the dominant westerly winds, and this caused the slip face to become stable. And then the windward face of the dune would grow higher, but the Fremen kept pace with this and replanted. Kynes thought of his plans for Arrakis as the book describes it. He and his team would plant tougher sword grasses, add processed chemical fertilizers, build wind traps and dew precipitators. Later, careful not to pressure the fragile new ecology, they would add deep plantings, including amaranth, pigweed, Scotch broom, and dwarf tamarisk, followed by familiar desert icons such as a saguaro and barrel cactus, and the Fremen also introduced insect forms. Populations of tunneling creatures to aerate the soil. He then takes his wife to see what he has accomplished. As they entered the cave, she could smell water. There were flowers, shrubs, and trees. She was amazed. And she could also hear the sound of running water, such an alien sound to Arrakis. Irrigation systems controlled it to keep this new life alive. Freeth, his wife, said, "This is paradise." Kynes waved expansively at the enclosed grotto and says, "Remember this well, my wife. All the Fremen must see this. Dune, our Dune, can be like this in only a few centuries."
Next we look how Pardot's legacy is passed on to his son.
They both arrive at a Fremen area where they believe the village has been poisoned and many of the Fremen there have been horribly maimed and killed. Liet finishes the lives of those that would otherwise have lived in pain because the Fremen would consider them demons if they were alive otherwise. Even their water would not have been used. Liet picks out a disguised trail, and near the cistern he smelled a harsh alkaloid bitterness, the unconverted water of life. It had been put into the water here, and then he saw an ornithopter had landed, a Harkonnen one, and both father and son began to plan how they would hurt the Harkonnens back. As the Fremen with Liet moved out, they all made the fish sign at the first moon. Liet was disguised to look like a water-fat village boy, and they would make the Harkonnens pay. Fremen informants working with the Harkonnens had studied crew assignments and route logs, so the Fremen knew who had done the poisoning. And a Distrans bat landed on Stilgar's forearm. He gave it a bit of water and brought the cylinder to his ear. It told him a location for the Harkonnens. Later, and as we started with, the Fremen allow the Harkonnens to see two of them. A Harkonnen fired his lasgun at them, and the Harkonnens in the ornithopter land as they get close. As they pursue, one of the Harkonnens returns to the ornithopter, only to find a Fremen there who killed him, and as the book paints it, the sand around the remaining ones erupted. Human forms popped out of the dust, covered with grit, tan human silhouettes like animated corpses boiling up from a graveyard. And the Harkonnens were put down, as the Fremen had closed fast enough so the lasgun could not be used on them. Liet removed the eyes from one and bound him. The Harkonnens' water was not taken. Stilgar then says they'll perform a ritual so the Harkonnens' soul will never rest and cover their tracks after, so their souls will not follow them back to the Sietch. Designs to aid this were drawn in the sand, and Stilgar intoned a chant. One trooper who ran is said to be an offer to Shai-Hulud, and within a minute a worm came. Later Stilgar and Warwick go to a merchant of water, Rondo Tuek. The building they saw was connected by pipes and trenches. He confirms he has received their spice payment, and so gives them supplies for the return journey. But they're in the Arctic Circle of Arrakis and decide to stay and climb the nearby glaciers. Whilst they are there, they find a single footprint, and signs that others have been wiped out. They moved carefully and found a trail, and there was a hidden door, and then 4 camouflaged men emerged with weapons and forced them down the tunnel. The leader of the smugglers is revealed to be Dominic Vernius, and they are now his guests. They are smugglers, and Dominic reveals that he once worked for the Emperor, but now moves against him, and Stilgar and Warwick agree to help Vernius's smugglers' camp. Later, Liet and Warwick are camped together. They are taking equipment from a nearby weather station, and they discuss how they both must choose a mate. They both want the Naib's daughter for a ruler, and later she asks for 2 days to decide, and then she lays down a test Whoever meets her in the Cave of Birds first, she'll give herself to them. It's a meaner challenge. It was a test in which the Fremen youths proved themselves worthy of manhood, and so the Fremen friends raced. 2, perhaps 3 days faced them. They both switched from worm to worm, but Warwick reaches the Cave of Birds first. When he sees a boot print, he knows Froula is inside, and so he steps in, and she greets him as her husband. Liet arrives in time to realise he has failed. Liet did, though, return to the smuggler's Antarctic base. He wanted to be taken away from Dune, but before leaving he left the couple after trading on his father's name for fresh fruit. His leaving is treated as if he goes on a holy pilgrimage. He searched and found the smugglers. After not being recognised at first, he was taken to see Vernius and aids him off-planet on Seleucia Secundus. Liet says to them his outsider name is Waishi, and there Liet and Vernius meets Gurney Halleck, who has escaped from Gidi Prime and advises the smugglers on how to hide their trails. Liet sees how Seleucia compares to Dune. They're both harsh worlds, and it's in this moment he decides he must return home. When he goes, he meets up with Warwick again at the pole. Warwick observes he looks water-fat. They set off back to their sietch, but see a big storm approaching, and so seek shelter. It's a Coriolis storm, or in Fremen, Hulasikali Wala, the wind of the demon in the open desert is the translation of that. They seek a small outcropping. The wind whispered in Liet's ears, electrical fields nauseated him, gave him a pounding headache, which would only decrease if he grounded himself well on the sand. They leapt from the worms, who dived into the sand for their own protection. The Coriolis storm was scouring the ground and howling like an angry creature. Liet could no longer differentiate between desert and sky, but the hole was deep enough for one person when they got there. Warwick says Liet must go in, as he is the son of Kynes, that's the Fremen name for Liet's father, Pardot. They debate, and Warwick says God must choose. They threw bone sticks and rated the throws with numbers, and Liet won. Warwick says Liet must take care of his wife and son. After the storm passes, Liet sees a figure still out in it, and rushes to see it's Warwick. The storm has torn off half of his flesh, and his friend's body also has additional damage. Warwick says, out in the storm he had a vision. Liet takes his friend back to Redwall Sietch, where Warwick is treated. Warwick's wife wears the colour of mourning, and because he lived, men came to listen to him, and he enters a council of elders, and Warwick says he wants to take the water of life. All Fremen knew you could not survive this unless you were a reverend mother. Then he begins to preach that he has heard the voice from the outer world, the Lisan al-Gaib, and says he must take the water of life to see the path. They give him the water to see if he is the Lisan al-Gaib. So with many Fremen watching, he was given it. The Sardina says Shahulud will judge him and his vision. Warwick then says that he saw the hawk and the mouse, and that they are the same, and that they won't be able to control him. He says the Lisan al-Gaib will come, but he will not be what they expected, and then the poison was too much, and he passed. Over time, Liet yearned for Froula. 3 months passed, and then they were betrothed, and Warwick's young son also became his. Liet spoke to the Naib about doing this first, as Froula was not a spoil of war, where a woman and children are taken on automatically. They exchanged vows, and the Naib announced that they are married and united in water. After Liet argues with his father, saying the Fremen are not his test subjects, but people, Liet wishes Pardot talk to him as a father and not a colleague. Pardot accepts this and says his son sees more things than he does, and his son is his successor. Later, Pardot Kynes sees how the progress of the rebirth of Dune is going, and in the cave he sees there are cracks in the cave that might affect the work going forward. These get worse, and there is a cave-in. Then we turn to Stilgar, who comes to Liet with information on his father, who died in the cave-in, and Stilgar encourages Liet to carry on his father's legacy.
And next we carry on with Liet, and we'll look at how the Fremen try to expose the Harkonnens and what they're doing on Arrakis.
The Fremen moved across the desert, blending in with their surroundings, and they moved towards Sietch Hadith. It was a legend. It held all meanings originated there. It was a place of conflict back to the first generation of the Zensunni. Now it belonged to the Harkonnens. They would each add to their tally of the dead that night with the Fremen. The Baron was using this place to hide spice, and it was not logged anywhere. Stilgar found the Sietch entrance. It had no seal. The door was open. It was a waste of moisture. They slew the first few guards they found, and then took the guards' last pistols. 6 more were killed without the Fremen making a sound. Stilgar found a barracks with 24 guards inside, and the Fremen captured and disarmed the guards, and they are then put to work. And Stilgar tells them all this illegal spice will be reported to Kynes, a strategist suggested by Liet Kynes, and the sailors are unloaded for the Fremen ornithopters to pick up. And after the Harkonnen guards are mostly dispatched quickly and painlessly, the cowards the Fremen take longer with. Those dead were then taken away to be rendered in a death still. The Baron would retaliate, so Stilgar moved the population of the nearby village to the safety of the Sietch, where they might become Fremen. Liet, meanwhile, met the Emperor. Liet speaks of the harm carried out by the Harkonnens, and that he and his father planned to bring life to Arrakis for populations to come, and that it was being ignored what he was telling him. The Emperor says the Spice Minister will deal with the requests, if they have merit, and Kynes knew then that the Fremen would have to take care of Dune for themselves, and the Imperium be damned. And so he returned to Dune and his Sietch and family. A spotter sees a man approach the Sietch. It was someone they knew, Turok. They wonder what's happened to him. On the spice harvester, the Harkonnen troops had lifted off the cargo and then abandoned the crew and equipment to the Sandworm. Still and Liet decided they must deal with this themselves. Liet wants a gathering of Fremen to organise them, and only then will the Baron know their strength. Once gathered, Liet spoke to them, saying they must take action, because the Emperor will not. They must fight for their home. One Fremen, Pemak, draws his blade and challenges Liet to answer him. Liet accepts and is accused of trying to make himself leader of all the Fremen. There was a scuffle. Pemak tried to fall on his own blade, but Haina, another Naib, stopped it and scarred the challenger instead. Then Pemak says, "I move that we elect Liet Kynes as our Abu Naib, the father of all Sietchers, to lead us all." Liet says the smugglers no longer can be trusted. He must speak with the guild directly. Rondo Tuek, the water merchant who ran the smugglers, would also have to be dealt with. Liet and Still and 3 of the Fremen bypass their security systems. They found Tuek and Still removed his tongue, Liet his eyes, and then his ears, so he could not see, listen or speak, and finally they removed his hands, so he could take no further bribes. Liet met a guild representative. The guildsman from the waist down's body was an unclothed mass of amorphous, waxy flesh, as if it had been melted and hideously regrown. Fleshy webs joined his fingers. His yellow, protuberant eyes seemed alien, as if implanted from an exotic, dangerous creature. It says they will continue to operate, but the bribe that the Fremen pay to not be seen by satellites must be doubled. Liet says no middlemen now need to be paid. The guildsman responds the Harkonnens demand better satellite surveillance, and after further discussion they settle on an agreeable sum. Stilgar meanwhile watched as the Harkonnens landed at an abandoned village. It's been abandoned because the Harkonnens had poisoned it. Then the Fremen strike. Lasguns melted flesh and sawed through bone as the Fremen moved down the dune on boards, and they secured the carryall, and they preserved the Harkonnens for the death stills. Liet watched a flat salt pan, and at the appointed time, a black ornithopter flew over and landed, and the recovered spice from the carryall is given to the Space Guild, and Liet says the guild will not increase its bribe again, and they agree. Liet says the Baron has secretly been stockpiling spice, despite the monitoring of it by the guild, and later the Spacing Guild. Chom and the Emperor Sardaukar had come to investigate certain irregularities in spice production, so the guildsman, Elric, listened to his words. Liet says to Stilgar they have taken some of the Baron's spice hoard, and now they must strike. whilst the Trome auditors are around. They must set fire to the secret spice hoard at the spaceport, and when this happened it took them all by surprise, all the powers gathered there, including the Baron. The Baron plays this off to the Sardaukar that it's just an industrial complex accident, and to the Mentat auditor he explains why it exploded, as there were volatile chemicals stored there, and perhaps a careless worker had not done his job. Later the Fremen gathered, and Liet saw the shadow on the moon's bright face that resembled a desert mouse. Muad'dib comes to watch over us, he said. They gathered for a spice blow, and Stilgar sees worm sign. Liet wonders why it comes so close. It was an ancient one, and then many more came, forming a circle around the ancient one. The abrasive flow of sand made an undertone of whispering thunder. Liet says all the Fremen must witness this. The worms looked to the sky, the colossus at the centre towering above the rest. As the other worms circled, the larger ones' rings began to fall away from it until it dissolved into sand trout, who burrowed away, and the other circling worms then left with them. The Fremen gathered, agreed they had witnessed a holy moment of rebirth. Stilgar murmurs, "Bless the Maker and his water." His voice was joined by the Fremen companions. "Bless the coming and going of him. May his passage cleanse the world. May he keep the world for his people." A significant passing, Liet thought. Something tremendous had changed in the universe. Shai-Hulud, king of the sandworms, had returned to the sand, opening the way for a new king. In the greater scheme of things, birth and death were intertwined with the remarkable processes of nature. As Pardot Kynes had taught the Fremen, life, all life, is in the service of life. The entire landscape comes alive, filled with relationships and relationships within relationships. All there had witnessed this omen, that an important birth had happened.
Next we turn to the giant sandworms of Dune, who the Fremen worship as Shai-Hulud.
Now, sand trout, or little makers, were, as the Dune Encyclopaedia states it, a larval form of the sandworm. They were a single-cell organism. Nutrients would be absorbed through the cell wall. Now, in terms of size, the sand trout were usually 20 centimetres long and 6 centimetres wide, and their shape, as when later the makes a maker suit out of them, were able to adapt to their environment. They could be found attached to each other, sometimes walling off several litres of water from the area around them. And one thing interesting to note about the life cycle is that when a female calls a male, she raised herself up and threw herself down, calling the male to her. And this created a rhythm clearly, and that is why the Fremen used the same type of mating call to summon the sandworms, using the thumper. Eventually, the spice fibre egg is placed into a sand nest, which over time ruptured, releasing the sand trout. They would then seek out water and join bodies with each other to transport the water back to the nest site. This water would then mix with excretions from the larval form to make a pre-spice mass. When the pressure built, the mass would explode. This is where the term spice blow comes from, and this explosion would drive to the surface the products of the pre-spice mass. And there, sun and air changed this to pre-spice melange, and the chemical reaction driven by the spice blow caused changes in the combined larvae that made them similar to the adult worm, and gradually these joined together and became capable of changing into a single sandworm segment and metamorphed over 1,050 years into the sandworm. So roughly speaking, each of the little makers becomes a segment of the larger sandworm, as I understand it. Once alive, the sandworms would defend their territories against each other. These fights would consist of each worm using their teeth to hook the ring segments, opening them up to the irritation of sand. Rarely did these fights end in death. When one worm sufficiently irritated another, one would break off and retreat. Now, one last bit of trivia of interest that doesn't tie directly into the video, but is related to the sandworms. As the Dune Encyclopaedia states, excess gases not utilised for nutrients were literally ignited by the heat of sand travel. Thus the worm always had a flame deep within the body cavity. Each worm produced all its nutritional needs from inorganic compounds on the planet's surface. The energy to do this happened when the worm travelled through sand through an electrostatic charge, and the presence of water would make the electrons discharge abnormally, as negatively charged and positively charged ions on the worm's body would dissolve into it. Now, I'm not sure I clearly understand this part as stated in the Dune Encyclopaedia. What I will say is if the worm eats as it moves through the charge, then when this is removed, they starve, and that is why water was a poison to the sandworm. As I understand it, call it my take on it.
Next we go a little deeper and examine the relationship between the sandworms and water.
You see, my climate demands a special attitude towards water. You are aware of water at all times. You waste nothing that contains moisture. For the Fremen, the water in your body does not belong to you. It belongs to the tribe. So, for example, when a Fremen dies, they are not buried or cremated as someone might be in our world, but they are rendered down into water so it can be reclaimed. Or during ritual combat between two Fremen, whoever loses, their water is used to replenish the winner, so even in death nothing is wasted. With a Fremen suit in good working order, you won't lose more than a thimbleful of moisture a day. To be able to conserve as much as possible, they had many customs to preserve the water. One of the biggest parts for this were the Stillsuits. These are filtration systems for the entire body. To reclaim the moisture that would normally be lost, headgear would also be used to prevent sweat from the scalp and forehead being wasted. For the Fremen's breathing, the suit came with a mask and nose plugs and would allow the Fremen to survive in and move through the open desert. When the suit was fully working, the Fremen would only lose a tiny amount of water each day. The suit filters impurities, making water to drink that could be circulated to catch pockets. From there, all the water will be made available to drink through a tube attached to the neck. So you see, water is life to the Fremen, as it was once for Dune itself. It was the coming of the sand trout and the worms into which they grew that transformed the planet into the arid landscape it is, where once it bore green life and water, now it is barren desert. The trout helped terraform the planet by absorbing the large bodies of water on Arrakis that existed, creating conditions for the sandworms to become dominant over hundreds of years. The worms can grow to hundreds of meters in length, and they are drawn to rhythms in the desert. So if you were to walk at the same pace, they would come to you. The spice harvesters that search for the precious spice melange also attract their interest for the same reasons. They believe they are being challenged and are very territorial creatures. The water the Fremen value so highly is poisonous to the sandworm, even in small amounts. So you can see the ties that bind them, the Fremen and the water, and the worms and the desert, opposites coexisting, but the people of Arrakis struggle. But water also represents hope to the people of Arrakis. The Fremen have been storing water all over Dune and plan to use it one day to change Arrakis from the desert it is to a lush place of life again, whilst preserving the deep desert for the worms to continue to survive. So the Fremen would no longer need to struggle to preserve the water and their life, and they could retain the worms, allowing both halves that struggle to coexist.
We look to the Dune Encyclopaedia and its attempt to explain various things regarding the blue eyes that the Fremen receive from their time on Arrakis.
It is, as the Dune Encyclopaedia outlines, a complex biopolymer originating only on Arrakis, and amongst what it can do, one thing is interact with the various centres of the central nervous system, the immune system, and the deposition within the sclera of the eyes. The interaction with the central nervous system is mainly in the coelicocramp centre, and this controls space-time awareness. This, in most people, consists of a small number of cells in the central brain cortex, and spice grows the number of cells that the person becomes aware of, letting that person be better at this space-time environment around them, and this action with the cells makes the spice addictive, and it also is clearly an attempt to explain some of the prescient abilities that people have and the awareness that they have as well. This can become severe when it's taken in excess, with as much as 2 grams each day per 70 kilometres of body weight, and the dangers of withdrawal are insanity and eventual death due to the breakdown of the cells in the central cortex, and when it breaks down, the effect on the other cells within the central nervous system. Research produced by the Bene Gesserit means women who can become Reverend Mothers have, as the book terms it, well-developed Colica-Cramps centres. One theory on this part of the Colica-Cramps centre is sex-linked, that Paul, for example, is a mutation, and this would also explain the powers developed in the Atreides over later generations. There is a precedent for this amongst guild steersmen who develop a highly developed Colica-Cramps centre. And the Colica-Cramps centre I keep referring to seems to be something I can't find online in terms of explaining what it actually is in real terms, so I'm just going to go with the idea that it's a theory based only within the Dune Encyclopaedia. And if you know different to that, then drop me a comment. Also, the lifespan of an addict can be increased by 2 to 4 times that of a normal human, with some variation for when the spice was first taken and the size of the dose that was taken. Something from the spice is absorbed into the person's bloodstream and interacts with the T cells of the immune system, making them immune to much of what ails a normal human. It also gives an immunity to common poisons, and later in fact refers to this in the first Dune novel. A big change the spice gives is the eyes of Ibad, or how an eye's shade, particularly in the Fremen, becomes blue. It's thought that part of the melange has an affinity for the stroma of the sclera. These are both parts of the eye. The melange may become entrapped within the eye due to the low level of water binding substances in the sclera and the blue pigment in the eye. Another benefit this gives, as posited by the Dune Encyclopaedia, is that the sun of Arrakis comes through that blue film over the eyes, is filtered there, and it increases people's vision capabilities. It is a rite of passage for Fremen Sayedina to become Reverend Mothers by hopefully surviving the water of life. To do this, you have to ingest large doses of melange. Should you succeed, you can gain access to the knowledge of previous Reverend Mothers. The Bene Gesserit were among the first groups to deploy it, and because of the Missionara Protectiva, I'll explain that in a moment, the Bene Gesserit, when arriving at Arrakis, recognised the ceremony and how it matched their own attempts at making Reverend Mothers. The Fremen, for their part, with increasing sophistication, have been using the ceremony since they had arrived in Arrakis as Zensunni wanderers. The Mishnara Protectiva is, of course, responsible for sowing the seeds of superstition in primitive cultures, so that should they ever find themselves there, the sisterhood can take advantage of these seeded legends. The ceremony gifts the Fremen with their own Reverend Mothers, and aided with that ancestral leadership, they are able to survive even the harsh world of Arrakis under the Harkonnens. When Paul and Jessica came to the ceremony, it was ready for mythic exploitation by Paul. The water given in this ceremony was taken by drowning a stunted sandworm, the poison being produced with its last dying breath. And now a short aside. One thing I've been thinking about is why it is called the water of life. It is produced from the bile of a dying sandworm and brings back the memories and personalities of those who have passed. But where it makes sense to me is bringing in those memories back to life within the form of the new Reverend Mother, the combined memories of those before, given new life, rebirth if you will, under the command of her. They never really die. It gives life back to them. The Reverend Mother would then be tested by her having to change the poison using her abilities into an awareness-expansing aphrodisiac by changing its molecular structure. To aid with the water, each Sietch would keep a number of makers trapped to restrict their growth to 9 meters. Under Muad'dib, his Federkeen would have the water of life presented at military triumphs, and the Sietches were hard-pressed to meet the numbers of little makers required during that time. In Dune, it is the prior Reverend Mother that brought Jessica into the fold, as we just went over. Jessica bent over the spout and smelled the cinnamon. An acolyte Chani, a Sayedina, would serve and recite a litany, another link to the Bene Gesserit influence on Arrakis perhaps. Dune tells us it goes like this. Here is the water of life, the water that is greater than water, Can, the water that frees the soul. If you be a Reverend Mother, it opens the universe to you. Let Shai-Hulud judge now. As numerous documents show, Lady Jessica did emerge from the ritual as a reverend mother. So you can see the Bene Gesserit's influence, where there is a litany of fear used by them in certain situations. Here there is another litany that the Fremen use in the ceremony. Frank Herbert tells the moment of Jessica's memories awakening like this: "And the memory mind encapsulated within her opened to Jessica, permitting a view down a wide corridor to other reverend mothers, until there seemed no end to them. Jessica recoiled, fearing she would become lost in an ocean of oneness. Still, the corridor remained. But for Jessica, there was a consequence. At least some others must have suffered similarly for people to be wary of Jessica's choice. This was Jessica's unborn child, because it also made the child a full reverend mother when Jessica herself took the water of life. All those memories from previous ones were also born into her daughter. She would later be called an abomination. She would of course be called Alia. The term is recognised by the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and it is told to us like this in the Dune Encyclopaedia. It involves the possession of the host's psyche of a preborn by the overwhelming personality of a genetic ancestral pseudo-life. The term preborn is defined in the Bene Gesserit Azar book as that soul resting quietly within its womb bed, whose entire life is destroyed by a pre-birth knowledge of its ancestor's persona. The danger is in the child attempting active communication by calling individuals from their memory, perhaps not recognizing the dangers as a young child. The more frequent a child calls a persona, the stronger the persona becomes, eventually being able to intrude upon the host consciousness at will. It can then go either way, with that personality becoming dominant over the host body, but some have protection, as with Paul's children, later the second and Ganima, who, like Alia, had those memories at a young age. The conversation goes like this: "I know the history of it," Ganima said. "But if that's true, why don't we suffer from this inner assault?" Later replies, "Perhaps our parents stand guard within us." When the Bene Gesserit encounter this sort of situation, they have commandments to avert an occurrence of it in the future. In the Book of Azar it tells us, "No woman who has become one with the water of life may thereafter bear a child." So that's the first commandment. Then, no woman may ever feel safe from the threat of possession, so they are always on watch, on guard. Then, no woman with child can participate in any form of the water of life ceremony, upon pain of death. No child born under these accursed conditions shall be suffered to live, and no adult found to be possessed, even if born outside of the condition of abomination, shall be suffered to live. So they're very clear on how they feel about this. Paul later went along his mother's path. He saw he needed to take the water and had one drop. It put him into a coma for 3 days. Then he was revived by Charney, and after this he could see what the Bene Gesserit could not, and could access the male and female halves of his ancestors' memories. So I think the difference here between what Paul has access to and what the Reverend Mothers have access to, the Reverend Mothers have the access to the memories of the previous Reverend Mothers, whereas Paul here has access to the memories of all his male and female ancestors, an incredible length of knowledge going back such a long time. Imagine what you could learn from that. Do I think it's more explained when Leto does something similar with his memories, that he takes them on board and listens to them? I'm also aware that there's some debate in the Dune fandom that what Paul actually gains from taking the water of life is the male and female halves of his ancestors' memories. Paul speaks about being a fulcrum point between the male and female halves. Now, I've gone back and forth on this, but I think that is what Frank Herbert was reaching for, though he doesn't explain it very clearly, and I think the idea is evolved and shown to us when Leto has those same memories. The grey suit prevents water loss, and they are worn like a second skin. A Stillsuit lets someone keep their water loss in the desert at 15 millilitres per day. When the Fremen arrived at the planet Arrakis, they were called the Zensunni. They had worked as labourers in their past and had retained knowledge from that time. One such machine that they would have used, according to the Dune Encyclopaedia, is a cryogenic separator. It had been used on a number of worlds for drawing oxygen and other gases from a planet's atmosphere. The Fremen remembered the technique and applied it to the manufacture of still cloth. The fabric, a micro-sandwich in its completed form, was produced in layers. As the Dune Encyclopaedia continues, the innermost layer consisted of a porous membrane, allowing the free passage of perspiration, exhaled moisture, and other bodily secretions. It was also an efficient insulation, protecting the suit's wearer from evaporative chill. The next two layers accomplished the separation of reusable water. A complex system of fine tubes permeated the fabric. They were equipped with check valves at various points to keep the system's contents from reversing directions. A pumping action is done in the suit through the wearer breathing and heel pumps on the soles, and this builds up pressure in the suit at a preset level, which I assume could be adjusted to the atmospheric conditions where the suit was worn, and the air would be moved into a holding chamber in the suit's hood. And the effect of this was that it cooled the air and cooled the water, and the cold water was drawn back into the suit's system and again run through the suit, and this reduced the temperatures in the suit's layers. This cycle would carry on until the temperature was dropped to a level that could liquefy ammonia that had been produced in the thigh pads that produced urine. When this was liquefied, the air was retained in the hood chamber and ammonia was pumped into the tubing system. This would keep the temperature down until it was converted to a gas by the acquired heat, and then air was cycled through a trigger again. And as the Dune Encyclopaedia finishes, passing through this chilled area returned the trapped water vapour, protected from ammonia contamination by the airtight nature of the tubing system, to liquid form. Water then moved through the pump pressure and osmosis to be trapped in the fourth layer. From there, another tubing system routed the reclaimed water to the suit catch pockets, and salt precipitators in the second and third layers removed most of the water's salinity. Body heat, passing through the other layers, will, with what remains, go into the fifth layer, along with unreclaimed gases. Now, for some of these suits' history, back during the Butler and Jihad, there were distilling suits used by the Fremen and replicated by Venport Industries for any Fremen who worked for them. And improvements by Venport's perspective were made to the suit. The inner lining reinforced the filter pads, made more efficient. This Stillsuit was quieter than anything he had seen in his old Sietch. During the novel House Carino, there is a brief scene of a guildsman, not fully transformed, wearing a stillsuit, and it is said to be of poor workmanship and ill-fitted, his warped body. It may not work, but the guildsman is meeting Fremen, so he may need it or may be wearing it to try and get them to aid him by looking like one of them. In God Emperor of Dune, we see Musean Fremen who wear useless stillsuits. The Dune Encyclopaedia tells us in a number of his journals the God Emperor referred to them as sand dandies, at whose dress a true Fremen would laugh until no laughter remained. When people notice during the reign of his father that the Fremen are the source of the Emperor Muad'dib's power, to advance their positions, some would adopt a custom, wearing stillsuits beneath their courtiers' clothes, much like the museum Fremen from a certain perspective. This reaction was not appreciated, as you can imagine, by the Fedaykin and Paul particularly, as the suits did not work at all. And finally we dip into Heretics of Dune, where a spice smuggler called Tuek, as the book tells it, the stillsuit under his robe was only for display. No pumps or catch pockets, no uncomfortable and time-consuming adjustments required. So, the stillsuit's perception as a savour of life over time was disregarded to be a relic worn for history or advancement, a sad end. In Frank Herbert's Dune, how exactly do the Fremen ride giant sandworms? It's one of the many cool ideas in the book, and I've always wanted to understand the answer. Let's find out. Paul planted the thumper deep into the windward face, where the sand was compacted and would give maximum transmission to the drumming. With abrupt decision, Paul released the thumper's latch. The clapper began, revolving, and the summons drummed through the sand. Summoned by the sound, it appeared more than half a league long, and the rise of the sand wave at its cresting head was like the approach of a mountain. Paul waited on the sand outside the gigantic maker's line of approach. Its great teeth within the cavern circle of its mouth spread like some enormous flower. The spice odour from it dominated the air. As it emerged further, Paul moved alongside the worm, ensuring 1/2 metre for every metre of the maker's diameter to avoid the vortex of its passage and still have time to run in and mount it. Its cresting front segments through a sand wave that would sweep across his knees. You then use 2 hooks to catch onto the leading edge of a worm segment, preferably towards the front of its body. You then brace against the worm's body with your feet and secure yourself as it continues to move forward. The worm then begins to turn to move the sand away from going into its soft innards and irritating it, so it rotates away from the side you hooked on. If this is done wrong, as even the young Fremen can, then it will rotate towards you and crush you. The rotation ends with the ring segment opened as far away from the ground as possible, and you are on top of and riding the worm. From here, by yourself, you will need to turn it. When the hook was firm and tested, he brought down the first one, thus worked his way down the side. The maker rolled, and as it rolled, it turned, coming around the sweep of flower sand, where the others waited. So, open segment on the left to turn right and vice versa. The other Fremen can then climb up using ropes you throw down. I think everyone who rides the worm must either stay secure with the hooks, or what makes sense to me, and I can't see it stated in the book, is to secure yourself with rope, perhaps against one of the scales on the worm's surface, and then use the hooks to guide the worm as needed from that secure point, like a safety rope when climbing. And I think the first to get on top of the worm, in this case Paul Atreides, must keep segments open on top to make sure it does not go below the sand surface again. With more Fremen riding it, moving the worm is done much like before. Paul motioned 2 steersmen out of the line and into positions ahead. The left side steersman opened a ring segment there. In a majestic circle, the maker turned to protect its opened segment. Maker is a Fremen word for the giant worm. The Fremen religion demands close obedience to a single leader, whose choices carry with them life and death. These Naib have to fit what the tribe needs them to be, which will often be challenged by others. Such as we see with Stilgar and Jamis. When Paul and his mother first encounter the Fremen, the Atreides are quickly assessed by them. Stilgar sees their value, Jamis does not, and loses his life because of it. Thus, the Fremen held a paradoxical notion of social order. The leader of any group was supreme, but only if everyone who belonged to that group wanted him to be. This is a quote from the Dune Encyclopaedia. This structure lasted for thousands of years. And why? Because everyone works for the tribe. There are 2 changes I must note that are exceptions to this. One is Liet Kynes, who influences the Fremen to want for more, a planet with life on it, and Paul Muad'dib, who fulfills their prophecy and leads them to a war against so many that have oppressed them over the many centuries. Before they stopped wandering, the Fremen were called Zensunni wanderers, and that still holds influence now. This is shown in the Zensunni belief in a single God who does not look at the small events you live through every day, but at the larger, long-term picture, perhaps a sign of how their population survives being moved around so many times, that it was part of a larger tapestry that they could see and that God wanted for them. The Sunni part of their faith is nicely summarised as for the good of the tribe, its justification for otherwise distasteful acts. Leaders of these Sietch or communities could be challenged in combat, as we see with Paul and Stilgar in the first book, where it appears they might be pitted against each other for the tribe's leadership. This was largely resolved by Stilgar remaining the leader of the Sietch and Paul being the leader of all the Fremen on Arrakis. And in line with this position of leadership, the leader also dispenses justice. They are the judge and jury, as he would be under Sunni Shia law. This Zensunni faith also extends to the giant sandworms that they live with on Arrakis. And here's another full quote from the Dune Encyclopaedia. To the Fremen, the planet was Shia-Lud, the deity or spirit of Arrakis. It stood for the sandworm, which was the essence of all sandworms. Shia-Lud was the old man of the desert, old father eternity, and grandfather of the desert. The sandworms of Arrakis were both the bane and boon of Arrakis. Another part of this faith was with the water of life. As part of the Fremen ceremony, it shows how they will treat their god with awe, but he could be practical too, and make use of it to the tribe. The water of life is a liquid retrieved from a sandworm as it drowns, and it's given to the Sayadina, or Reverend Mother of the Fremen, when she is near to dying and a replacement needs to be found. A woman is chosen and the poison taken, and if she survives, by which I mean she has been able to convert the poison to something inert, then she will gain the genetic memory of all her predecessors and become the new Reverend Mother. For the tribe, she then regurgitates this liquid, and it's shared amongst the Fremen, so they experience a spice orgy, a shared narcotic experience amongst them, creating a closer bond. So they both partake of the body of their god and also use it for the tribe to bond to each other. In the Fremen, we can see their mass distrust of authority to the point of the extreme when they go on their rampage around the known universe in their holy war or jihad under Paul. This shows they do not want to submit to authority, and this could link back to their time as wanderers, making their own choices, and even how in the present tense of the first book they have hidden so much of who they are and what they can do from those in authority, showing their deep lack of trust. This is another quote from the Dune Encyclopaedia. The Fremen believed that all were utterly indifferent toward whether they lived or died. Such forces simply existed, the Zen side of them, Shia-Lud, whether literal sandworm or personified Arrakis, might bring harm or good to the Fremen. But whatever the end result, it was not on Shia-Lud's mind to do either. It was just the way things are, and they found value in their lives by dedication to the tribe or Sietch, which acted as its own enclosed world, a huge extended family and a government. The Sietch provided a place in the world, everything you could need, from purpose to companions to food and shelter. So under the Zen part of their Zensunni ancestors, the Fremen accept things as they are, and with this self-discipline, they avoid a frustrating struggle. In Zen, what you do is what you do. There is no scale against which to measure of success or failure. As a consequence, within its tight world, there was no place for those who did not understand it. The line being so slim, someone not up to the task could greatly hinder the survival of the group, a burden, a drain on resources. So the question becomes, what could they add that was not already within the operation of the tribe? The Fremkit is made up of items common to most Fremen. It weighs around 10 kilograms and is able to be compacted down into a small bundle. There is a theory that a Fremkit and a manual is presented to a Fremen youth as a way to transition them from childhood to adulthood as a rite of passage. Now let's look at and get some details for the items in the Fremkit. The first one we're going to look at is the Baradai pistol. This can be used for measuring or signalling. It was mainly used to mark off a big area, which could be used in the capture of sandworms, and to signal a spice merchant by marking an area to distinguish it from the rest of the desert if the spice merchant is airborne. This shows the skills the Fremen have
with technology to get items to work in the desert when so much more advanced technology does not, such as personal shields. The next item is the filth plug. They are used to stop the loss of body moisture. They are made of a spice-based compound. 2 parts go in the nostrils, and the outlet at the bottom fits into a stillsuit's catch pocket. The ends of each are made to give a snug fit, so no moisture is lost. They would feel rough when fitted at first, leaving sores, but eventually these become calluses and you don't feel that anymore. And so, all the air exhaled from the lungs, with its moisture, goes into the stillsuit's recovery system. If one filter becomes clogged, the user could still use the other nostril. For a plug to be cleared, you pull out the connections and blow backwards through the air passage, but this does not happen often, as with much importance attached to the devices the Fremen need in the desert, they would be checked for upkeep, the plugs cleared, and filled plugs would be replaced before a Fremen would leave or return to a sietch. Perhaps one of the more well-known ones we're going to look at maker hooks. They are used for capturing, mounting, and steering the giant sandworms, or makers of Dune. The lengths of hooks vary according to the size of the worm and the skill of the Fremen using the hooks. At one end was a hook, barbed at the tip, and at the other it was made to fit the grip of the user. In use, the worm is summoned with a thumper. Now this next part, the description of how the Fremen actually use the hook to get onto the sandworm, this is all taken directly from the Dune Encyclopaedia. The hookman, or first mounter, stood aside from the approaching worm. As the maker went by, the hookman inserted one hook beneath the leading edge of one of the sandworm's rings, and the other hook at a slightly lower edge on the next ring. The hookman braced himself back on the hooks, rolling upward with the worm as it rotated away from the threat of sand entering the gap opened by the 2 hooks. Once up, the hookman and followers steered the worm by opening the gaps down one side of the beast, prompting it to roll away from the gaps to prevent sand getting in. A Fremen youth would get his own hook as a sign of adulthood. Some believe that a Fremen must get these 1 part at a time. A hook that didn't fail would be considered lucky, and if the hook did fail, then it was believed this could mean bad luck for the tribe. The next item is a power compass. It lets the user select the magnetic pull that is to be the reference point, and then you can read directions relative to that source. The Fremen were originally wandering Zensunni, and they came up with the first crude compass. The compass will be used so a Fremen can find their way against the obstacles of sandstorms and dune shifts. The next item is the rep kit or repair kit. This can be used, unsurprisingly, to repair a stillsuit. It contains spare filters, a few lengths of water tubes, patch material, and poltivets. So if a tube is cut whilst climbing or creased during sleep, it can be fixed with a replacement tube, and temporary patches can be added if a stillsuit has holes in it. Maintaining a working stillsuit was a high priority when the Fremen ventured outside of their sietch. The next item, the sand snork, is used to get air into a tent when it's buried by a sandstorm. The snork pumps air into the tent. The next item is linked to that and is the still tent itself. The original version of the tent was made by the Zensunni, the Fremen before they came to Arrakis, that is what they were called. Those tents were crude, but did what was needed. The outer layer would turn white during daylight hours and go back to normal at night. The water that gathered on the surface trickled into thin ducts built into the bottom of the tent and then went into catch pockets in the corner. The process was repeated inside the tent
through moisture from the breathing of those inside it. This design then evolved on Arrakis. The homes were semi-permanent before Arrakis. On the desert planet, they work as a temporary place of shelter when you are outside your sietch. So their size was reduced, so they were just large enough for people to sleep in and have their equipment stored there. This new style tent had a door of clear plastic so those inside could see out, but this could be blocked by a flap inside when wanted. Several layers worked to capture moisture from perspiration and exhaled moisture and kept the tent cool, and a layer made of catch pockets and tubes for water consumption and storage was also there, and the last layer allowed heat out, but only one way. The next item on the Fremkit list is the thumper. As you may know, this attracts sandworms. The predecessor to this was called an impact hammer. It was used to study rock structures below the ground with sound waves. This attracted worms. This is where the idea came from, and this developed into the thumper that the Fremen now use. The thumper must be put into the windward face of a dune, and then the thumping is started. A tube and a stake resonate together to send out a low-frequency sound wave that reels in the sandworm. Its second use was to act as a decoy to draw a worm away from a Fremen. The Crysknife is, in simple terms, a single tooth taken from the mouth of a giant sandworm. Due to its ties to Shahulud, it's considered sacred by the Fremen. If you are an off-worlder and see one of these weapons under Fremen law, you would not be allowed to leave Arrakis without the Fremen's consent. The Dune Encyclopaedia says a number of never-explained deaths on that world may have resulted from the enforcement of that law. Shoutout Mapes gives one to Jessica Atreides and says, "Who sees that knife must be cleansed or slain." The beliefs around the knives extend to when Shoutout Mapes believes Jessica is worthy of a Crysknife, as was Duncan Idaho when he had proved himself in Stilgar's Sietch. And when a Fremen is young, a ritual will confirm that they are an adult, and a part of that is the gift of a Crysknife to them. If the blade is withdrawn, it could not be put back in the sheath without tasting blood. Even if this needed to be the user's own, you would be considered to have insulted Shahulud and bring God's wrath on you if you did not. The blade itself, in the Dune Encyclopaedia, is said to be a milky white blade, some 20 centimeters in length, which gave the impression of glowing in dim light. The first to take the tooth from the mouth was Selim Wormrider. In that case, the worm had died from exhaustion after being ridden through the desert for a very long time. The teeth are taken when the Fremen find a dead sandworm. As many as could be carried will be taken into the sietch, blessed and made into knives. There are two types produced by the Fremen. The first is fixed and the second is unfixed. A fixed blade, which could be stored for an indefinite period of time, was treated by exposure to a series of electric currents, which fixed the blade's electric field and kept it static. An unfixed blade remained stable only so long as it remained in contact with a living human body. Deprived of exposure to that body's electric field, it was weakened and crumbled within a matter of hours. The unfixed blade was used more commonly by the Fremen, so that it would not fall to anyone looting a Fremen body. If a Fremen was going to be captured or die in battle before the blade would break down, they would shatter it to keep it out of others' hands. The tip of the blade, where the tooth's nerve would have been, would normally be filled with some poison made from desert plants. The Fremen would use the poison more often against animals rather than an enemy they respect. The knife would have a raised lip around the handle to protect the user's hand if the other's blade came down its length. The Crysknife might have been styled after the Kinjal dagger, a blade the Fremen would know through their dealings with the Imperium. Earlier versions had that knife's shearing guard, which was later eliminated. It's said the Fremen give their blades names,
and hold those names a secret, even from their fellow Fremen. After the Naib's owner dies and their water is returned to the tribe, the Naib's handle would be taken also to that place. But if it was shattered in a fight, the Fremen believed that person had offended Shai-Hulud, and so had taken his strength from the tooth. The most common Crysknife was of course the one that was held by Paul Muad'dib. This went to his son upon his death, and it became used in later the Second's Ceremonies. Leto had control of the number of knives at this point. They were in short supply. The museum Fremen still performed rituals, but did not know the history behind them. So Paul's knife became the last of its type, as the user still knew the traditions and myths that held it apart from more common, less holy weapons.
To reclaim water from a Fremen's body, you need a death still. According to the traditions of the Fremen, the water in a man's body is owned by the tribe, not the individual. The body, when put through the still, would be supervised by a reverend mother-in-waiting, a Sayedina. All the community, or Sietch, would gather around the dead Fremen's belongings and their water bag afterwards. The leader, or Naib, would speak and remind the others the moon would rise for their lost comrade and would summon their spirit that night. He would then declare himself a friend of the fallen tribesman, speak of a moment when he'd been helped or been taught by the deceased, take an item of theirs and some others for the dead person's family. The Crysknife would be left with the remains. From Dune, at the funeral of Jamis, Stilgar turned full circle on one heel, passing his gaze across the ring of faces. "I was a friend of Jamis," he said. "When the hawk plane stooped upon us at Hole in the Rock, it was Jamis pulled me to safety." He bent over the pile beside him, lifted away the robe. "I take this robe as a friend of Jamis. Leader's right." Other people in the tribe would then follow, declare their friendship and its reason, and then take an item until nothing remained except the water bag. A Sayedina was last and would verify the bag's measure and give the water rings to the relevant person. Water rings are metallic counters and are a measure of the volume of water released by the body through the death still process. Paul, for example, killed Jamis and would receive the weight of his water to replenish what he had lost in combat. A prayer would then be chanted, a prayer to commit the spirit to Shai-Hulud, the Fremen name for the worms they worship, and they would all recommit their own destinies to their god as well. If the person was not killed in combat with another Fremen, the watermasters of the Sietch would take the bag and pour it into a communal basin. This would be witnessed by the whole tribe, and this was the end of the ritual. One example of the meaning water holds for the Fremen was when Paul Atreides, after killing Jamis, shed tears. To do this at a Fremen funeral was giving water to the dead and was regarded as a profound moment. It is not just the members of the tribe they take water from. The death still can also be used on their enemies. This is from Winds of Dune. I believe it is Alia Atreides speaking. "We have chosen a style of Fremen execution reserved for only the most heinous criminals. You will be put in the death still while still alive. We will draw out the water from your body, bit by bit, leaving your mind aware until the last." It was the practice of the desert dwellers for Fremen, women and children to go over the battlefield. Once the fight had concluded, they would kill the enemies of the tribe using crysknives. I assume these are people that were injured and that weren't able to fight still. So the enemy's water would be reclaimed for the tribe. We can assume the water from those corpses would go back into the tribe and the corpses would be discarded. An exception to this would be when someone is found guilty of something. Their water would be considered tainted. This happened to Alia Atreides. Her water was poured into the sands of Arrakis. So we've gone over the ceremony, friends, but what of the death still itself? How would that work? There was an attempt made to explain this in the Dune Encyclopaedia. This first part will be a direct quote. The Death Still's major components were 2 plasteel vats, one within the other, plus a heating device and condensing system. Its use was very simple. The body was placed in the inside vat, and the space between the walls of the 2 vats was filled with maker oil. The lid on top had a valve and a vapour tube. Heat from the outside of the device was transferred by the oil from the outer to the inner vat, and the liquid in the body began to boil. As it escaped from the valve, it was directed down the tube and collected. The Fremen say a man's flesh is his own, but his water belongs to the tribe. After the distilling process, water measurement, and mingling with the tribe's water hoard, what little residue remained was treated with utmost care and buried in the earth to share with Shai-Hulud. The pressures of the group carry authority amongst the Fremen, so any figure that carries it, namely the Naib, must comply with the understanding and decision-making of that group. He was a voice and was in service to the tribe, but did not directly command the people within it. Within a sietch, no policing is needed to make sure people comply. Everyone has their role to play and must do it for the good of the tribe. Going against these norms was rare, and even then would be handled by the family unit. For example, as the Dune Encyclopaedia states, the mother of a shamed family would have her child put to death if he or she were possessed or mad. To be Fremen was to know your duty, and the Naib did not need to define that to anyone. Amongst the former Zensunni, authority was about respect and the power that was held within a personal community message. Pardot Kynes was an example of this. He unified the tribes into one vision and did this not by forcing what he believed on people. He was an outsider and communicated the message through respect for their way of life. His vision of changing the ecology of the planet Dune would allow the Fremen to change while still meeting the essential parts of their social order. He persuaded them of the benefits of his message. Each sietch maintains independence under its own Naib. The leader has to hold to the ideal virtues of the community, Stilgar being one example of this. As the Dune Encyclopaedia says, his strength, moral certitude, and total devotion to Sietch Tabr comes through forcefully. He obeyed the necessities of tribal preservation and evaluated all possibilities in terms of his duty to his people. When he did make a decision from long experience in Arrakis, the way of deciding was so firmly established that any Fremen who served as Naib would come to that same choice. The Naib mainly would have to make sure water and security was provided for his sietch. These two duties bound up all other needs within them. A Naib can be challenged in combat, as nearly happened between Paul and Stilgar, but such a challenge to remove a leader had to be preceded by a vote of no confidence, so only when a Naib makes a mistake and is not properly carrying out his duties is the challenge made. No male would challenge whilst the leader remained good. When he did falter, a challenger gained popular support and would then be able to call out the Naib. Those who challenged were men of stature within the sietch, who had both qualities of leadership and a deep commitment and understanding of the Fremen way of life. They could not only be the best fighters, but men who could guide the tribe in and through its day-to-day struggles. Within every sietch is a council of wise men, and they advise the Naib. They have influence, but not authority. They do, however, deeply embody the shared myths of the Fremen. All Fremen share that deep sense of grief over their history. The council's interpretation is usually listened to by the Naib. The Naib's position and the council own experience in the sietch, meaning they came to the same conclusion frequently. Before the council itself, all Fremen could speak. Things that spoke to the collective will of the Fremen gained the most influence. A speaker would try to link what they wanted with the traditions of the Fremen. Paul Muad'dib was able to sway the council and get them to break with tradition by tapping into that common grief of the Fremen. We will now go over a
short section from the original Dune novel which covers what I've just mentioned. Paul swept a hard gaze across the throng. Who is there here to say I'm not the rightful ruler on Arrakis? Must I prove it by leaving every Fremen tribe in the Erg with a leader? Beside Paul, Stilgar stirred, looked at him questioningly. Will I subtract from our strength when we need it most? Paul asked. I am your ruler, and I say to you that it is time we stopped killing off our best men and started killing our real enemies, the Harkonnens. In one blurred motion, Stilgar had his Crysknife out and pointed over the heads of the throng. Long live Duke Paul Muad'dib, he shouted. A deafening roar filled the cavern, echoed and re-echoed. This brings us to the role of the Reverend Mother in the Sietch. She, as the Dune Encyclopaedia says, wielded the authority of history. She was in contact with all Fremen who came before her. Not the Naib or the Council could go against her wisdom. She would establish a framework which others would make decisions within. She did not work against the Naib or Council either, for to go against them would be to go against the Sietch or community. Each part of this authoritative structure carried the function of preserving the Fremen way of life on Arrakis. Each Sietch worked to keep its independence, but also coordinate with others when their struggles were common. Under the leadership of the Mahdi, the Lisan al-Gaib, the Council was able to bring together the forces that put an end to their oppressors. After this, the leadership structure that had worked for so long all fell under the Atreides. Distrans or Disploid transponder is a type of communication device developed by the Fremen, and the means of communication are coded messages placed into the neural system of pretty much any creature. This started, according to the Dune Encyclopaedia, during the Butlerian Jihad. At the time, there was a lot of research into animal nervous systems. The size of these and developments in circuitry meant this could lead to thinking machines and towards a deeper understanding of neural physiology, which is an understanding of neural activity, i.e. what goes on in the brain. The Zensunni, who in large part later became the Fremen, uncovered this, and as their journey led them to Arrakis, they had mastered this. A Distran has two parts, a wave translator and an encoder-decoder tube. The tube has Shigawite inside, and this was powered by the body's electromagnetic field. In terms of the message itself, that served as a password, would be spoken into the tube, and it would be held to the carrier's ear. The message was spoken to the Dune Encyclopaedia explains that the ED tube digitized the signal and fed it to the wave translator, which changed the signal to normal electrochemical stimuli and locked them into the host's nervous system. And this is where the wave translator comes into play. It would cause the message to be broadcast at set intervals, and another part would stimulate the host's vocal center, so the message would be hidden within a creature's natural sounds. When the host messenger gets to their destination, the wave translator was decrypted when the password was repeated, and this would also trigger a final message to broadcast. The ED tube would receive the info, translate it into motion, and speak with the voice of the sender. A fairly complex nervous system can carry this message. It can be used in birds and bats, and there is an example of one of them in the first Dune novel by Frank Herbert. With these creatures, when the wave translator was placed in the carrier's brain, the region of the brain controlling the animal's vocalizations, and it was easy to find and hard to damage. These creatures, under the band of the Fremen, also had great homing skills. Producing them was not so easy. They were small and carried sophistication in them, and the breeding of creatures for this purpose and the then training of them was a use of the Fremen's limited resources. But if well done, only the password needed to be known by the user, and the system was secure. These creatures would rarely be captured, if even recognized, and so the password rarely had to change. The wave translator, also once correctly set up, could be cleared and reused for another message. But of course there was a downside also to these methods. Birds could not go into buildings without being noticed, and it would look very suspicious in most cases, I would think, making the Distrans difficult to use in places such as Arrakeen. Bats were limited by their range, and they could not search for their recipients, and also probably the weather affected them if they were ones that flew in the dark, and they would have to be trained to go to certain people or locations, instead
limiting their message drop-off points and probably increasing the chances of them being seen and the message being captured. There were efforts to insert these into human brains. These would play the message when the carrier triggered it with the speech. Those with the resources switched to this type. But at the time, humans with machines implanted were not welcome, and so there were protests raised, and this practice ended when the crystal scramblers ended the devices, having a practical use. Another type of secret message are Chakobsa, which were employed during the First War of Assassins. It means jargon or shop talk, and would be used at its earliest before the Assassins as a term by different working groups such as falconers and carpenters. The Assassins' language one outlasted these other ones, as it had a large vocabulary for devices and techniques, and so it was kept in use and it would not die out, and the term that meant Assassin's jargon then later meant Assassin's secret language. The great houses and the military then employed it as they needed a way to send secret messages, and so it led to them adopting the Assassin's method. These variants of the mother language became loaded with specialised words, so for example, they were used by the Sardaukar. We do get an example of it recorded by Princess Uralan. Jessica is speaking to Shadout Mapes, and she knew Shadout was a title, and she knew that through her brain gesture at learning. Jessica sees Chakobsa in its earlier sense. The Dune Encyclopaedia explains the Fremen Chakobsa was not just the code of hunted clans living on the margin of the law. It had a slang of their own, devised for security, but it was based in the language of the assassins. The Fremen would use the term in security activities as well as ritual purposes. One theory is the Fremen saw the Sardaukar use it. For the Fremen it was a complete language and they adopted it for themselves, but this is only conjecture. To finish, as the Dune Encyclopaedia says, the Chakobsa of the Sardaukar has been completely lost, and the guess that the Fremen learned botany from them is no more than a guess, until additional light is shed on the provenance of the Fremen ritual, and hunting languages, guesses are all we have. The Fremen, once having established themselves in Arrakis, still had their Zensunni beliefs, and part of that belief was obedience to a single authority figure. This position was not one earned easily. It would give you a title of Naib, and with this you would have to follow the group's notion of what a leader was. Perhaps, should you fail that definition and the overall community or Sietch lose their faith in you, then you will be challenged by another. But when they were the leader and supported, their authority was supreme. To the Fremen, Shai-Hulud was the spirit of Arrakis. They were both the bane and the boon of the planet. They could eat a man who walked with rhythm, or they could transport members of your Sietch across the desert. They also play a vital role in Fremen rites. For example, a worm drowned in water will produce the water of life, which, having been converted by a Reverend Mother, became a powerful narcotic, and this was used in Tau orgies, and we will come back to that a little later. So from a certain view, they kill and take in the spirit or essence of their god. So we get this contradiction again with the sandworms and with the Fremen, who are in awe of them, but also drowned and eat of them, or in another way, they would question authority, but also destroy the figure that brings that, as the leaders can be followed and also killed and replaced. So that's a similar cycle with both the sandworms and the Naib. This can be said to spring from how they believe that forces around them simply existed and could affect your lives, but they didn't care. They just existed. There's something untouchable, elemental about them. So to explain that a little clearer, so if Shai-Hulud killed a Fremen, then it could be said that it was his will, or it is just the way things are, an acceptance of the danger perhaps from the lives they live. Now they did see value in life as well. It wasn't nihilistic. They added value to and meaning to their lives by focusing on what they could do for the Sietch. It was the identity of the Sietch that was more important to them than the overall Fremen as a culture on Arrakis. And for what they did, the Sietch provided back, giving an individual, an extended family, as the Dune Encyclopaedia tells it, the Sietch demanded and received great loyalty from each of its members. It gave them a place in the world. If you committed some act and was banished from the Sietch, you stripped yourself of likely both your life and your cultural identity. The Sietch as a group shaped people's behaviour. What furthered the good of the group was encouraged, and there was no room for the uninformed. The Sietch as a group and its members provided answers as yes or no, because there was no room for maybe when it came to survival. If an outsider was allowed to join them, one thing that was considered was the burden they would place on the group's reserves, but in addition, also what that individual could add. So, Paul Atreides is a good example. When he kills Jamis, he eliminated that person and Jamis's burden on the Sietch, and then replaced it with himself. And of course, he also took on the responsibilities of Jamis's wife, Hara, and their children, so he meets both criteria. And now, as promised, we return to the Tau of the Sietch. Another term that makes things clearer is the sense of oneness of the Sietch, the unity in their identity and community. Each Sietch had a reservoir where all water from them was stored, and there also was stored the water of the dead. This was a show of respect for those gone, and for example, dishonoured Fremen's water would carry that person's stigma and would not be added to the overall amount the Sietch had access to. So in a way, the Sietch preserved all members of itself through this, both living and dead, because the water would be drank by the Fremen, but every drink of it would also contribute to it in the same way eventually, when they in turn passed away and gave their water and life back to the tribe. So there was a oneness with every member of the Sietch, so by taking the water you took part in the Tau. Now the Tau orgy of oneness also brought them into a physical oneness. It showed them the ways of their fathers, a bond with the past, present and future of the tribe, and you could only get this by being part of the Sietch. The Fremen's approach to water is heavily linked to their environment. The harshness and the struggle they have to obtain this vital ingredient for survival means it's viewed by the Fremen as sacred, and the Dune Encyclopaedia states it could be fought over, conserved and treasured. With this came a mythic aspect and the need for a priestess to conduct the use of the water in ceremonies to ensure it's treated in the way it should be. The term for the Fremen priestess is Sayadina. First, we will look at the birth of the Fremen. Their first exposure was moments after birth. The fluid surrounding the newborn from the mother was saved and distilled and then given back to the infant by its godmother in the view of a Sayadina, and this re-ingestion of water was the child's first feed, after which it was given to the mother for a normal feed. This created a water bond between parents and child, stressing the unity of the tribe. A vital job within the Sietch is that of the dew gatherer. They in stillsuits and using dew reapers take the available moisture from the plants that grow nearby. This water would be gathered and given to the Sayadina for her blessing, and on then to the tribe's communal basin. The head of each household would come to collect their family's daily allotment of water there. When a Sayadina distributes the water, she gives extra blessings to the use of the water and those drinking it, and prayers are given to Shai-Hulud for providing this means of survival. Then at the end of their day, a family would divide the water produced from their water reclamation chambers. It was considered bad luck to leave water standing. It would need to be stored in an evaporation-proof basin. Now we turn to water rings. They show the amount of water released by a body from the death still and could measure a range of water weights, as this clearly also would be important to the Fremen. Even small amounts could be vital to the tribe's survival. Counters related to water released by Fremen who had died naturally or by enemies killed in combat were given to the Naib and held for all the tribe, a water gift from Shai-Hulud. An untried youth who had not fought another in combat was not able to marry, as they had no water rings to give. This requirement helped control the polygamy granted to Fremen males. They could not be given to more than one woman. A male, though, could get more rings through challenging other males, and then pass them on to various women amongst the tribe, but this was derided and laughed at by them, so it's not something that one should do. A female Fremen would not be given rings or water if they killed an outsider in combat, but they could be given to the tribe's reverend mother to confer Shai-Hulud's special blessing on the donor. After death, rings would be returned to the tribe or worn by the woman. Upon the death of a member of the tribe, they would be put through the death still
supervised by the Sidina. The tribe would gather around a mound made from the dead person's belongings, and the water bag released by the death still. The Naib would talk, saying how the moon rose for their lost comrade, and it would summon the spirit away. And then he says he was a friend of the deceased, and speak of a time that person had helped or taught them, and then take an item from the pile. The famous version of this being, I was a friend of Jamis. Then the Naib would take specific items for the fallen's family, though the Crysknife would be left with their remains in the desert. Then other members would speak of their friendship, and when they were helped, and take an item. When only the water bag remained, the Sidina would check its measurements and give the water rings to the right individual. Then the members of the tribe would chant a prayer to send the spirit of their friend to Shahulud. The water masters of the Sietch would take charge of the water bag, and the entire tribe would view this and pour it into the communal basin. Now we look at water bonds. So to illustrate, when people in a Sietch save the lives of each other, there would be a water bond, and this debt would carry to the tribe of that person as well. The debt would be a burden, and the Fremen would try to repay this as soon as possible. The water of the group's dead, when shared, would create an unbreakable bond with the other group. They would become one group, in fact. If an enemy got a member of the Fremen to drink of his blood, then they would be joined, and his water could not be taken, unless he offended the tribe. So no Fremen would bite an enemy for this very reason. Pledges of loyalty were carried out in the name of water, such as a tribe to a Naib. This pledge would not be broken and given to a new leader until the original leader had passed and their water was free. I'll touch on one interesting fact about the water of life. If a Sidina seeking to be a reverend mother did not convert to poison and die in that case, only in this specific scenario would the Fremen cremate the body, and the water of life would be carefully set aside and guarded till a new candidate was found. The cremation is because if the body was put through the death still and given to the tribe through the water later, it would poison and wipe out the tribe. The water of life could also not be left in the desert, as if it was allowed to contact a pre-spiced mass, it would become the water of death and wipe out the planet's ecosystem, killing the creation of spice and the sandworms over time. Now, with one exception, the Fremen treat the water with the highest care. That one exception is when they face the water of one who has been possessed. They do none of the Fremen ceremonies we touched on before. There is no prayer. The demon within that person means the water is forever tainted, and here the water is taken out into the desert in the heat of day and poured out till the steam takes it away, and for this time a guard might be posted, so no creature even will taste it. Now, of course, a person being possessed relates to when they have multiple minds in their brain because they've taken the water of life. In this next little part, we're going to look at how Paul ascends to being the leader of the Fremen. When there are so many Naibs and Sietches, how does he become that one leader? That's what we're going to explore in the next section.
The Fremen cavern was packed with people. Jessica thinks they must not lose Stilgar. A young Fremen man asks Paul if he will call Stilgar out. Paul waits for silence from the crowd, then speaks for the Fremen as a whole when he says, "You are tired of waiting." He holds a message cylinder. It told Muad'dib that Rabban had been abandoned. No aid would come to him from the Baron. Paul asks those gathered if they think the Lisan al-Gaib is stupid, and he will call out Stilgar. Jessica observes he is starting to use, if not accept, the religious mantle given to him by the Fremen. Paul says, "Ways change." A Fremen voice challenges and says they decide on the changes, which Paul accepts. And in the next part he uses the voice. He follows with, "You will hear what I have to say, though." He says that over everything, the good of the tribe is what matters, to a lot of agreement. To this, Paul puts to them, then, who rules this troop of our tribe, and who rules all the tribes and troops through the fighting instructors we've trained in the weirding way? Paul says even Stilgar does his bidding sometimes, and the wise listen to him. And then Paul asks if his mother rules, as the fighters listen to her, even though she has not fought herself. Jessica sees Paul's strategy is to go right to the depth of their uncertainty, dispose of that, and all the rest must follow. Paul says to be a leader, you must be challenged in combat, and says the goal of the Fremen is to unseat the Harkonnens and make Dune a world where they can raise their families in happiness. Paul asks if a Fremen would smash his knife before a battle and says, no one, not even Stilgar, can stand against him in single combat. Jessica thinks, though her son uses the voice, it will not be enough with the Fremen, who are insulated against his vocal control. He must also catch their logic. This is when he holds up the message cylinder and says, Haraban fights alone, i.e. the Harkonnens are cut off, as one in the crowd confirms. Then Paul makes his real bid for leadership and brings out his father's ducal signet ring. And Paul says, I swore never to wear it again until I was ready to lead my troops over all of Arrakis and claim it as my rightful fief. He puts the ring on his finger and clenches his fist. The cavern goes silent, and it seems he has them. Paul says he rules all. It was given to his father. Paul feels he almost has them convinced at this moment. Then he goes on to say that those with him will hold positions of importance, and Stilgar will be one of them, as he's wise. Do the Fremen think Paul would lose that to provide them with a circus? And then Paul says, who is there here to say I'm not the rightful ruler on Arrakis? Must I prove it by leaving every Fremen tribe without a leader? He says he will not take from their strength, but will keep it for their real enemies, the Harkonnens. Stilgar raises the Crysknife, his Crysknife, and the others follow. Still shouts Paul's name, Muad'dib, and the others join in. When this dies down, this further, Paul tells Stilgar to kneel and hands him his knife, which he does. Jessica thinks this part was not planned, and the Fremen Naib repeats Paul's words after him. I, Stilgar, take this knife from the hand of my duke. Then, when my duke commands, there shall I place this blade. Jessica is stirred by these words, and I think this evokes a Atreides ceremony. Stilgar continues to repeat Paul's words. Then I dedicate this blade to the cause of my duke and the death of his enemies, for as long as our blood shall flow. Then at Paul's command, Stilgar kisses his blade. This fulfills part of the Bene Gesserit prophecy they set up. And then Paul says that Stilgar as a leader speaks with his voice, and so Stilgar loses no position in the eyes of the other leaders. Then Paul gives his first command as the leader of the Fremen, and then nodded for his mother to accompany him, leading the way down off the ledge and through the throng towards the central passage and the living chambers that had been prepared there. As Paul pressed through the crowd, hands reached out to touch him, voices called out to him, my knife goes where Stilgar commands it. Paul Muad'dib, let us fight soon, Paul Muad'dib, let us wet our world with the blood of the Harkonnens. Feeling the emotions of the throng, Jessica sensed the fighting edge of these people. They could not be more ready. We are taking them at the crest, she thought. So to my eyes, much of this is orchestrated, and there are still Fremen leaders to arrive at the gathering who will see that Paul has already won over much of the Naibs, especially the younger men who are pushing for him to fight Stilgar. And this keeps Stilgar in a position where he can serve the Atreides and allows Paul to attain his desert power as he willed it. I feel Paul and Jessica knew of this to resolve the tensions beforehand, and Stilgar perhaps, though I'm not entirely sure that he would be comfortable with it being so staged. Why do you keep secrets? I think the most noble reason is to protect someone from danger, to save them from the forces that would destroy them if the secret came out. That, to me, is why the Fremen do it. Secrets now, to protect their future. In Frank Herbert's Dune, what are the secrets the Fremen keep? Why do they feel the need to hide so much? What is their goal? Friends, let's find out. When I say secrets, there are things that the Fremen on their planet Arrakis keep from the larger Dune universe, in particular the powers that rule, such as House Corrino and Chom. Chom has control over all the economic affairs within the Imperium, but must rely on the Spacing Guild to transport goods. How these secrets play out in combat can be found in another video here if you would like to look. All the quotes and information are taken from within the original Dune book only, so spoilers for that throughout. The Spacing Guild have a bottomless demand for the spice, which can only be found and mined on Dune. This is because the guild expose their guild navigators to spice, so they gain prescience, and whilst the guild highliners, those are ships for people and goods, move through folding space with the Holtzman drive, it is the navigator that replaces the computer's navigational computations lost in the Butlerian Jihad. This was a war against thinking machines to remove them, and with prescience, the ability to see future timelines, the navigators can see where to fold the ships to, so they don't fold space into somewhere dangerous, such as a star or planet. The Spacing Guild gets spice through whichever house mines it on Arrakis, but clearly they want as much as possible, so they can continue to transport goods and people around the Imperium. To this end, they have a secret deal with the Fremen, who use their own spice harvesters to take the spice, and it is used then to bribe the Spacing Guild. With this paid, the Guild ensure their satellites do not cover parts of the desert of Dune and protect the Fremen's privacy. During the rule on Dune of the Harkonnens, there are a lot of Fremen killed each year. The Baron believes, but he comes to a revelation on this during a conversation with his mentat, Peter de Vries. Mentats are human machines, and for context in the next part, a Sietch is the name of a Fremen community or village. If they had just 250 such Sietch communities, their population would be around 5 million, but there could be more like twice that many communities. 10 million at least. De Vries then gives the Baron a conclusion about the Fremen. We've weeded out some of their less successful specimens, leaving the strong to grow stronger. The Fremen hide their numbers to protect themselves and the mining they do, to not show the ruling house of Arrakis, another name for Dune. They can control the path of the giant sandworms if the mining machine attracts one with its regular rhythm, which they often do. The ruling houses cannot do this, and their spice harvesters get attacked by the worms. And of course, to not show, the Fremen can ride giant sandworms, and for one other reason, to not expose their plans for Arrakis. The Fremen collect and hide large catches of water in underground reservoirs, with the hopes of one day terraforming the planet. We change it slowly, in secret for future generations. Open water and tall green plants, and people walking freely without stillsuits. Stillsuits allow the Fremen to survive in the desert for long periods of time. So that is the dream and hope that drives them to hide so much from the wider galaxy, the promise of a future free of their current hardship.
And there, friends, at around 2 hours and 8 minutes, looking at it just prior to recording it, that is the end of the video on the Fremen, their origins and cultural development from the Jihad through to and including Dune. I really hope you enjoyed listening to this. If you got to the end, well done and thank you very much. This video is a long-term goal for my channel to do focused compilations of videos all in one area, something I really wanted to do when I started, and I'm glad I've accomplished this goal. So if you've got any comment down below, anything you think I might have missed, I really hope I haven't, but you never know when you're doing videos. There's always something that slightly escapes you.